Welcome to the State of Cybersecurity Industry panel series. We are proud to bring together decades of cybersecurity experience from world-class experts, executives, and strategic advisors. We will explore the present and future of cybersecurity evolution, talk about compliance and regulation, best practices, emerging threats, and the impact on the IoT and OT device market.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Evgeniy, and I will be moderator today for the State of Cybersecurity Industry panel brought to you by Cybeats. Today's topic is building automation, smart building, and smart cities. Joining us today, Fred Gordy, Director of Cybersecurity and Intelligence Building, LLC. Fred, welcome.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Evgeniy. This is a great opportunity and a great forum to bring this topic to the world. So thank you.
Thank you. Andy Kling, Industry Automotive VP Cybersecurity and Product Security Officer at Schneider Electric.
How you doing, Evgeniy? How you doing, Fred? Glad to be here today.
Awesome. Thank you for being. Dr. Andreas Kuehn, Senior Fellow at Observer Research Foundation America. Welcome, Andreas.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me, Evgeniy, Andy, and Fred. It's good to be here today and very much looking forward to this conversation.
The changes brought by the mass migration to remote work has forced evolution on both home and office automation. Long-term trends in building management systems are inflecting in the ways that are important to those that live and work in them, as well as those who build them. Join our expert panel while we discuss and debate the impact and implication of these changes. We have several topics we plan to discuss today, and don't forget, it's a live event, so please use YouTube chat to ask questions. We'll make sure we address the questions in the end of the show. And let's begin with some of them. So, Andreas, about smart thinking influencing today's smart buildings, what do you think? Can you provide what is important for smart building and smart cities and what's influencing them?
Sure, Evgeniy, happy to. I think it's a very good question, right? I think in some sense, as we just discussed a little bit earlier in the preparation room, those things are somehow still a little bit disconnected in terms of its developments. But I think are certain forces at play that obviously influence each other. And I think in part it is that while they might be somewhat separate, there are also certain commonalities. And part of that would be some common objectives, I think, that they have on an overall level, right? So making smart cities and making smart buildings more sustainable, more energy efficient and effective in their use and resources that are part of those systems through the use of ICT and IoT is one of those major goals I think that they share in common. We talk about the monitoring of certain processes, for example, energy use or air quality could be something you do in buildings or in smart cities on a more aggregate level. Predictive maintenance through AI. Another example, you can do this, on a building level. You could do it on a dam. You could do it on other kind of larger infrastructure. So I think a lot of those commonalities there. And also when it comes to applications, you think of like energy, transportation and traffic, surveillance, security and safety. I think they can equally fall in place in either of those domains. But I think in many ways, this is very much a technology-driven development. New technical capabilities, allowing the remote monitoring of those processes I mentioned earlier, I think makes people just think about what can we do to make our lives easier. And I think that's where this comes in. So I think those new technical capabilities that are drivers behind that, and then who match some of those challenges that cities today or buildings today are facing. I think that's where those two areas nicely converge.
I'm wondering,
yes,
if you can give an example. I know what's smart building, but what is smart city? Do we even have one city that's completely smart, or maybe part of the city?
It's a good question. I think different cities try to address different kind of challenges, right? And so I think, depending where a city is based, you might have different issues you're dealing with. Think of like an area that's prone to earthquakes. Maybe you want to use some technology that is more geared towards addressing that kind of challenge, or an area that is, close. Being in California here, wildfire is a big issue. How can you use smart technologies for your city to protect your citizens, to make things safe, but also make cities more resilient overall? I think that's where some of those examples.
If I can interject, we work with several people that have worked and designed smart cities. And, one of the things that's kind of interesting, we live in an app-centric world. We all have phones. We have little apps on there. If we want to do something, we go to the app store. Well, working with the people that I've worked with, they almost have this philosophy that the buildings in a smart city should be like just plug and play. I should be able to bring that building in, connect it to the infrastructure, and then have that building reporting up and become part of what most call a single pane of glass. So I can monitor every building, the energy usage, the water usage. I can look for threats, that kind of thing. So we've got a long way to go, but the methodology, at least the thought is, let's take a look at it from a holistic standpoint and kind of use that application-centric thought process.
Interesting.
I think those are some really good comments, Fred and Andreas. I would, at heart, I'm an engineer. And so I think of things sometimes top down, like you're describing a little bit, Fred, here, but also bottom up. What are the systems that make up a smart city? What are the systems that make up a smart building or other property? And for me, I really start to dig down in. You mentioned, I think, some really interesting concepts, Andreas, a moment ago about looking at like fire safety and wildfire history around a smart city. But are we looking at the communication systems? Are we looking at protecting HVAC? I think that's a really good one. HVAC is something that's highly automated these days, that has a lot of interaction with the internet. And I think most of us know interaction with HVAC systems in our own lives, connecting to our own thermostats. So how do we protect this? What are the layers of protection that we can put in place? And as I said, as an engineer, I start to break these things down, and you can start to see these elements start to pop out, the technologies that are in use that say, hey, we got to protect those communications. And once we reach that device, we have to have some sort of challenge and response or authorization and authentication set up so that we can protect these, because they can't fulfill their primary missions if they don't, if they're not protected. If somebody is in there and they're going to bring a ransomware attack against the heating of a smart city, for example, we all know that, that's something that's very serious, especially, if you're I'm in New England, and if something like that happened in the middle of the winter, that could be a very bad situation for us. We'd be forced to pay the ransom just to be able to react fast enough. We know that there are some critical systems that are part of these smart cities, that are part of these infrastructures that need protection. And I think that, that's the challenge that comes back to us. How can we protect them?
Andy, who is responsible? You mentioned fire safety. Is the building responsible on the fire safety, communication security, or the fire safety department responsible to build like this?
The term that we frequently use in the cybersecurity industry is resilient. And what we mean by that is responsibilities are shared. If a primary communication channel fails, is there a backup? Is there a backup to the backup? Is there a backup to the backup to the backup? So that, if communications is an essential part of maintaining that critical infrastructural component, it is resilient to cyber attack or other types of failures that might come in play.
Andy, if I may, I think you made a very good point there. I think what I also like to think about is like the different ways how, say, a city versus maybe buildings or an industrial area are organized, right? And I think of like a city. And please correct me if I'm wrong here. As a much more dynamic system with much more a networked environment in terms of a governance perspective, kind of like having a lot of different stakeholders, right? Where the municipality might be kind of one of the main organizers around some of those systems. But you have a lot of private entities that provide, third parties that provide certain types of services that make up the whole smart cities. Think of like, transportation services by Uber and Lyft, for example, right? That are kind of that make the fabric of a smart city, but are not necessarily directly regulated when it comes to cybersecurity by the city, right? Whereas in a commercial environment, in a building, right, you have like a one owner or one developer who kind of like can oversee maybe more hierarchically what decisions need to be taking place in order to make a smart building secure and safe. But I'm also curious because Fred, you dealt a lot with those questions and kind of what your views are on that.
Well, I'm going to go back to something that Andy said. Resilience is a primary thing to think about when you're looking at these systems. But I want to take a step back from that and then go back to resilience. It's when we think about IT systems, there's a principle called the CIA triad. Confidentiality is number one. In our world, it's flipped on its head. Availability is number one, and you can't take that away because these systems have got to be able to talk to each other. However, the methodologies, I'm sure some of the people may or may not be familiar with ISA 62443, and I was going to kind of talk about this a little bit later, but one of the primary things around there is setting up security zones and like talking about the fire systems. Well, obviously, backups upon backups upon backups are important for that. But one of the things that my world is not used to is classification, establishing the risk tolerance for each one of your systems. And therefore, when you do that, you can take that availability metric, if you will, and you can begin to narrow it down, put each one of the systems into security zones, and then you can establish a risk tolerance for each one, and then that goes to the design of the system. So,
Fred, you started to answer the questions I just wanted to ask. So
okay.
As SME in the new buildings, how do you architect systems to enable and kind of defend all the stakeholders? You already mentioned some different zones and availability. What else?
Well, so to kind of expand upon that is in this world, what we're not used to, and I see this all the time when my team and I go out and do assessments. You walk into a building, there's all these disparate systems in there, and one integrator has come in and put in the HVAC system, one's put in the lighting system, so on and so forth. But there's been very little thought as to true network security. And so therefore, the way to protect these systems, and ISA, when I was looking around at NIST and all these other, we got a lot of good standards out there. The problem is we've got an overwhelming amount of standards that the building controls world, first off, they haven't been looking at standards. So if you dump NIST 853 on their lap, they're going to go, what the heck is this? So if you take a look at ISA 62443, the zone and conduit model, is what that does is that sets up these security zones. It gives you the guidance to say, hey, let me take a look at this and see what the mission of this system is. And then once I've done that, I can group these things in their security needs. And if they need to talk to each other, the conduit, which is most of these guys understand that, run an electrical wire, but it's specific communication. It's not just wide open like what we see. We see systems that have public IPs in them. We have systems that the integrator has come in and put in log me in or something like that. And I'm sure you guys remember of last year, Oldsmar, Florida, the water treatment hack. That was all through log me in. And it was the guys that were maintaining the system were sitting there watching when the cursor's moving around. Well, stop and think about that. Why? Why did they not get reactionary to that? Because it's a common occurrence. Is they're used to the integrator coming in and doing whatever they want, whenever they want. When you set up these security zones and you set up the asset access levels and you put policy in place that says, you have to have approval in order to come in, that kind of activity would have been surprising, but it wasn't. It only got surprising when they started adjusting the chemical levels.
I'm itching to ask because this is something I touch almost day by day. The idea of zero trust, ZTNA, how does it apply in buildings, in smart buildings?
Well, it's interesting. We started a few years ago trying to model that into what we do. So the thing about it is I talked about availability. Availability is number one. So that means if I drop something on the network, it just sees everything. Well, there's some systems out there that afford zero trust, and what that means is when you put a device on there, it has to be allowed to talk to something else in order to be communicating. But once it's established that communication, now maybe this is the wrong way to look at it, but I kind of look at it like it's now that communication is in a shell. So you can't get into that. And therefore, if you have zero trust and something from the outside or somebody plugs in internally, which we had something like this happen, and thankfully we had a zero trust set up, is they can't see anything. There's nothing there for them to see. So it's very important in this world.
If I could just follow on a little bit with zero trust. The best thing about zero trust is it's got people talking about cybersecurity in a different way. Mm-hmm. The big challenge with zero trust is, just as you were describing, Fred, you were trying to describe your definition of zero trust and how you've gone about it. And the industry's still feeling around trying to find out just what we mean by zero trust. Mm-hmm. and at its core, zero trust is about not trusting. It's built right into the titles. It's about not trusting every interchange, every action that takes place, every change that wants to be made to a system. You don't trust it until you establish that trust. You're not going to act on anything. It's a great way to think about the wide variety of disparate systems that have to come together to make up a smart city, to make up a building, to make up a control system. And all of that has to feed upwards so that, somebody mentioned earlier a single pane of glass, but so that somebody can pay attention to these entities, this critical infrastructure that I mentioned before. Zero trust, I think, has a lot of promise to it, and the industry is going to find its way through it. We have to. We absolutely have to, because the world is going to be made up of a lot of different components, virtual or physical components, for many, many, many years to come. It's not going to be a single vendor with a single solution.
I want to throw something out. Maybe we can kind of knock around a little bit. It's kind of along the lines of zero trust, but not exactly. Everybody talks about air gap. I know I'm kind of interjecting something here, but, I run into this a lot where people say, well, I'm just going to disconnect everything. And I'm like, well, now you don't have oversight. So in my opinion is I tell people that air gap means you're not watching it, because the default is there's this false sense of security that if I just have it separated, nobody can get to it. Well, go ask the guys in Iran what happened to Natanz. I mean,
that was the candy drop attack. They carried USB sticks in, and the attack was underway. No, exactly. There's absolutely there is value in that connectedness, and what I've said for years, and I think we'll continue to see this as new generations are coming up and moving into this critical infrastructure space, and they're taking on those responsibilities, that accountability for securing this critical infrastructure. They're going to be coming up through that generation that started from that single pane of glass, that iPad, that tablet, that phone. They're going to be used to this connectedness. They're going to be demanding this kind of connectedness because there's value in that connectedness. So rather than trying to fight it, air gap, instead figure out how do we secure it. I'm not saying that air gap doesn't have its place. Of course it does, but so does connectedness.
That's really interesting. I haven't come across the air gap conversation for a little while. I think that shows a little bit how the different cybersecurity fields talk about different things, what they think is might be potential solutions to a problem they're facing. But I'm actually curious, and this a quick question back to you both, Fred and Andrew, about when we talk about zero trust. I mean, conceptually, you pointed out this is kind of developing, still pretty fresh and young. But in your daily practice, I mean, how often do you actually see those conversations happening, like in practice? I mean, it's a great concept. I think we all agree. We should move forward with this as fast as we can, because it will make a tremendous difference in security for buildings or smart cities. But what would you say? Where are we in this conversation in practice?
I'll just I'll answer quickly with an anecdote. A colleague of mine is in the cybersecurity service business. His job was to go out and assess properties, to go out and assess plants, to go out and assess critical infrastructure and determine its cyber readiness, its cyber posture. And he told me once that he only encountered 2 properties that were truly air gapped, and in both cases, they had men with machine guns guarding the entrances to these properties.
Yeah, so it's funny. Thank you for that question, Andreas, because this is right in the lane that I'm in. Our company spends the majority of the time in commercial real estate. And we've done it in the U.S., Canada, and abroad. And to me, it's amazing. No matter what country we're in, it's the same. Now, let me give you some quick figures. In the U.S., there are 87 billion square feet of commercial real estate. We've done thousands of assessments. 90% of the time, they don't even know they've heard zero trust. They don't know what it is. They know it has something to do with networks. But to that end is we have a cultural gap of understanding. And so when I hear people, going back to what I said earlier, throwing all these things at these guys too fast, too quick, they're going to balk at it because they're fixers, and they're going to, if they get too much on them at one time, they're going to figure out ways around it because they're not going to adopt it. So you got to kind of bring them in. But it's
Fred, I think this is where the correct architecture and like building blocks. We're talking about buildings or building blocks. When you not just put everything together, but you create layer on top of layer as they connect to each other, makes sense. I'm an architect by trade myself, so I really understand. And yes, unfortunately, the ZTNA, the zero trust, has become like a magical wand. Like, oh, we do zero trust, we will fix everything, but it's a process. It's a lot of things involved: vendors, procedures, segmentation. It's not so simple, but it's doable. It's definitely doable with the correct approach. Andy, you mentioned vendors, and I'm wondering how vendors can craft services to support safe and secure smart buildings, because security is important, but safety is also important.
Yeah. So thank you for that question. It's a good question, and I was glad to have it ahead of time so I could think of my answer a little bit. And I have 2 parts here. First, just a reminder to the audience, I work at Schneider Electric. So I'm a vendor. Vendors must recognize that we're part of a supply chain here. Sometimes we're providing complete end solutions to users. And sometimes we're just providing, we're providing components that become part of larger, more complex solutions. And we have to recognize that there is this long supply chain that exists that moves towards smart cities, that moves towards smart buildings, that moves towards this critical infrastructure as we break it down into smaller functional pieces. Sorry, there's a little bit of...
Yeah, it looks like there's some issues. We'll wait a second.
Okay, that quieted down a little bit. Thank you. So one of those things that we're looking for in that recognition that we're part of a supply chain is transparency. We have to be clear. Somebody mentioned Log4Shell, Log4j earlier. Log4j was the vulnerability that occurred right over the Christmas break at the end of 2021. And it had the world hopping very fast. Are we impacted? Are we impacted? How do we tell if we're impacted? Asset owners, property owners, they were asking these questions. OEMs like Schneider Electric, we were asking ourselves these questions. How are we impacted? And a significant part of that is to become more transparent in what makes up our products. Just a reminder, how can vendors craft products and services to support safe and secure smart buildings? Part of that is we have a responsibility as a vendor to be more transparent in what we're offering into this critical infrastructure, because we are part of that supply chain. And with that, we can start to answer questions like, where does this software come from? Where does this hardware come from? Am I impacted if a vulnerability is announced? If a threat actor is using a set of tactics and techniques, can I tell if I'm going to be vulnerable to those based on the ingredients that make up this software, this hardware? So transparency is certainly part of that. but it also includes responsibilities about product and service management through the entire life cycle. But what this is saying is you have to keep in mind that cybersec is not just a single point in time thing. You don't go follow a standard like 62443 and then declare I'm secure. It doesn't work that way because cybersecurity is a continuum. It's constantly evolving. There's constant new threats emerging. What was secure on Tuesday, on Wednesday will be declared insecure because a threat has emerged, a vulnerability is discovered, and we have to be able to answer to that. So think about the products that we're buying, that we're putting into our buildings, into our properties, as you have to constantly be assessing: are they providing that secure mission? Are they completing that secure mission that we have as a responsibility as stewards of these products? So Schneider Electric, OEMs, vendors, we have to recognize that cybersecurity keeps changing over time, and our products have to be kept up to date to answer those threats that are part of that. And I said there was a two-part answer. That first part was really about transparency and recognition that we're part of a supply chain. The second is a little bit more intangible. Cybersecurity in many respects is hard. We use a dense language. The challenges of climbing that mountain to understand how to secure a building, how to secure a property, can be very daunting if you're coming into this field. If you're a property owner and you're saying, how do I secure this facility? The level of complexity in cybersecurity is just too high, and simply this, we can be our own enemy. So we have to simplify. We have to hide this complexity. We have to take this cybersecurity framework in NIST 800 or the cybersecurity standards like the ISA 62443 standard that Fred mentioned earlier. Fred, I'm not stealing any thunder you might have.
Oh, that's good.
You have to make sure that by the time they get to actual usage in the field, we have simplified them, not oversimplified them, because there's still some very important, complex topics that are being dealt with when it comes to risk understanding, risk identification, risk management, but simplify them so that they actually can be put into use effectively. And I'll stop there because I probably could go on for another 20 minutes.
Well, to your point, I mean, you're spot on. The thing is we got to remember, IT didn't start where they are today. They got a lot of policies and procedures and things like that. So it's like I tell people, you have to look at it from a terms of, you're not going to, and I don't mean this in a, putting them down way, but you don't go into a first grader class and show them algebra. I mean, it's not going to work. They got to understand how to add, divide, multiply, do all of that stuff. And another thing, to your point, Andy, that supply chain, there's another term that I like to use going back the other way is chain of custody. And in 62443, there are three distinct bubbles. You have the asset owner, you have the service provider, that's the guy that's installing the stuff, and then you have the products. But that chain of custody is the asset owner ultimately is going to be responsible for what goes in his building. The service provider is given instructions of what it is that needs to be done. And then they go to the products that they're going to put in the buildings, and they have to meet those requirements. And then it comes back up. So when the product is given to the service provider has to make sure that it fits or meets the specifications. And then when the asset owner has it, in his building, it's up to him. To your point, Andy, it's cyclical. You can't stop. You have to keep checking. You have to keep
continuous assessment, right?
Right.
I mean, not to be overbearing about it, but you have a responsibility to ensure that component continues to be fit for purpose.
Yeah.
Do you envision a person or company buying a building and they're going to come and ask for all the software bill of materials from different software vendors in the company, in the building?
Well, I think it should be a part of a good due diligence that you do, right? Ideally, but the question, I guess, is at the end of the day, what is done in practice, and that would be actually, again, pointing to our practitioners and asking the question there. But I think the other one I was actually maybe adding to this conversation as well was, Fred, the model asset owner, service provider, and products. I think that helps to think along those lines. But what I'm often come across is the question: is the asset owner aware enough, or I don't want to use the notion educated about some of those issues, that he actually can make the right decisions when it comes to security of the products that are deployed in those buildings.
Agreed. I mean, it's an education process we're just at the beginning of.
So right now we have security cameras, and we have some kind of a security office when we see all the cameras and all the different LEDs that tell us what's wrong with the building. Would we envision like a SOC for software as well in the buildings, or maybe a way to pull all the software bill of materials to one location to aggregate them in case there's vulnerability or Log4j?
No.
Fair?
No, that's probably too granular. But it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done. You're asking the question about risk understanding, risk identification, risk management, and in that continuum of understanding, identifying, and managing cyber risk, you're asking the question: how would a building owner, how would a property owner identify the risk equation as it's changing? How would they understand that something has gotten worse? I've gone from traffic light green to traffic light yellow. How do they recognize that? I don't think the answer is they all have to have a software bill of materials for their building in front of them, and they're constantly looking up the threats against that. But there does have to be an answer.
The thing about it is, we see this all the time and forgive me if this is going to sound like too simplistic of an answer. I'm not saying we shouldn't get to that point, just like Andy said, but we need to start with the good asset management process for these systems. Because, for example, there was a medical group that we were working with about 4 years ago, or whenever it was, when WannaCry came out, and they were using this one particular device. Then they had thousands of these things, and it used Windows. And they called me up on a Sunday morning. What do we do? And I said, well, this is why we've been pushing for the asset inventory side. They have 1,500 buildings. They didn't know where all these devices were in order to go out and patch them. So, and I can't tell you, almost 100% of the time when I go in and do an assessment on a building, they don't have a good up-to-date asset. One more story. I was in Australia. There was the service provider was there, and we were checking the network, and he said, well, I only got 4 things on this network. And I said, well, they paid us to come take a look. When we checked the network, there were 32 devices on it. And one of those devices was a Raspberry Pi. And I said, in about 3 weeks before that, the article had come out from JPL about the Raspberry Pi on there. And this was a financial institution. I said, y'all need to go find that and get it out of there. It took them 2 weeks. There it is. It took them 2 weeks to find it. So, and that's not the exception. That is the rule.
We cannot protect what we don't know.
Exactly.
So let's switch topics a bit. And let's talk more about smart cities. When do you guys think we're going to have true smart cities? Who wants to go first?
Well, I'll go first because I already answered part of this. So a smart city, is a city that has a mission. Is that mission better efficiency? Is it to simplify? Is it to make people's lives better? You have to understand the mission, and then you can measure against that. Have we achieved that mission? Cybersecurity, since this is a cybersecurity discussion, says, and are we protecting that mission? Well, remember what I said. This is a continuum. Defining a smart city might be possible to say, I define this as a smart city right here, and I can list it in terms of efficiencies that I'm seeking or something along those lines. But cybersecurity is a continuum. So you asked the question, when will we achieve a smart city? It's really hard to say because because we have threats against us trying to achieve it. At the same time, we're redefining, globally, nationally, regionally, we're redefining what it is that we're trying to achieve from smart cities, from smart buildings. I can say that, in my own home, I've automated certain things because I've defined I have security system that's automated. I have HVAC that's automated. I have lights that are automated. I define certain things that are important to me. And I can say I've achieved what I want right now. I have nothing on my list of things that I want to automate from my own home. 2 years from now, that's going to change. Someone's going to come out and say, I can tie your HVAC system to this AI system, and I'm going to be able to better anticipate your air conditioning needs based on weather forecasts or based on historical data, and it's going to constantly be changing, and I'm going to want something different. So, I just push back on that. Is there a definition of what smart city is? Yeah, but it's always a point in time definition, and that point in time, it's only good for that point in time, and it will change immediately after. We got threat coming in from cybersecurity. We got technological changes coming along, and we have objectives that we're trying to achieve as a people, as a community.
And the reason I had to hesitate when you asked that question is because I've got real world experience with this, because we've worked with several smart cities, and the thing about it is it comes down to a business decision. Really, because when you start, we work on use cases, we go through all the systems that they want to have in the building, and there is this point where they begin to drop off because the money's not there, or for whatever reason, it doesn't make sense. So the systems themselves, how I alluded to before about the fact that they're looking for plug and play buildings. Well, the reason they're looking for plug and play buildings is that's simple. And I can get them into a smart city. So to answer your question, I can't tell you when that's going to happen, because I've already seen, I can't mention names, but I've already seen example after example. Everybody came to the table and they were all excited about having the smart city. And at the end of the day, they rolled off stuff because, that was too expensive, too hard, too whatever. So I don't want to sound like a naysayer and that it's not going to happen, but it is a challenge.
I live in an old city here in the U.S., Salem, Massachusetts, and we have clay pipes that are used for the water lines through certain parts of the city. And I can tell you, at the time when they put those clay pipes in 150 years ago, they thought they were very smart, bringing water straight to the public that needed it. Obviously nowadays these clay pipes fail on us all the time, and it doesn't look so smart.
So let's talk about challenges.
Let me respond, Evgeniy, to my view on that, because I think there were really good perspectives. I think a smart city as such, I never seen it as an objective in itself rather than a process, and so I think it's a continuous efforts that leads us to becoming better over time. It's kind of maturity that we are achieving while doing this. I wouldn't even try to conceptualize something as an end state because of the reasons that Fred and Andy actually provided, right? But I think above the conversation around safety and security from a cybersecurity perspective on a technical level, I think what I've been interested in also to have a conversation around safety, security, and resilience on a city level, right? Kind of how can we harness this technology to actually make cities better places that are more secure, that are safer, that are also become more resilient because the use of technology. And obviously the cybersecurity conversation, as Andy pointed out earlier, is an integral part of that, right? Because we can't go there if we don't have our cybersecurity in place. But I think that's an important part. And there may be a second component to what a true smart city is, and I think Fred touched on that briefly before, was what are all the different stakeholders? I think the conversation we're currently having is mostly how do we bring owners and producers of systems and software developers to the table to have this conversation. But I think in a broader sense, when we try to achieve some of those broader objectives of the smart cities, right, energy efficiency, sustainability, or say the safety aspect, right? I think it's really important to get like residents to the table, because at the end of the day, right, once we start implementing some of those capabilities or devices, cameras and so forth, do we want to have facial recognition or not, right? Or there are a lot of like also privacy questions that could come up and other types of security questions that need to be addressed. And I think that conversation, I think, is best reserved for a broader multi-stakeholder, if you want, approach to having those conversations. And again, I'm not saying everyone should have to say on the table what security controls are implemented, right? That's not the point here, but kind of like also to keep in mind what the ultimate goals of those smart cities are. It's for residents, and so they should be part of some of those conversations.
Yes, we just have new questions about more about the cybersecurity challenges. So maybe Fred and Andy, you guys want to comment on this part as well?
I'm happy to. Cybersecurity challenges. That's so I already talked a little bit about usability, so I won't go down that road again, but I will talk about one of the things that faces us is successful cybersecurity attacks. We see this probably most prominently with ransomware attacks. Ransomware, it's targeted at many different things. The Colonial Pipeline attack was an attack against infrastructure, and probably the one thing that we have to answer is, as cybersecurity adversaries are successful, not become, but are successful, we have to be able to recognize what they're doing. We have to be able to recognize their tactics, their techniques, and react quickly from a cybersecurity standpoint to be able to answer that. Now, I'm not saying that from a cybersecurity standpoint, we're purely reactionary. We wait to see what AI algorithm and adversary invents, and then we develop a reaction to it only after a number of people have been attacked successfully. But what I am saying is that that the challenge we have in front of us is three things in the technology space are really pushing the world forward. Computability at the edge, so we see this as those Raspberry Pis that showed up on somebody's network there. These Raspberry Pis have incredible amounts of compute capacity, 4 cores, 8 cores, all sorts of compute capacity. They rely on the ability to communicate faster and faster and faster, with communications. Video shows like what's going on here today weren't even conceivable 10 years ago. And then I'll just say cloud, but that's data storage. That's all of this off-premise. From a cybersecurity standpoint, we talk about adversaries using command and control capabilities. All of this is remote compute capacity to process large amounts of data for whatever purpose that they have. These three technological drivers are really changing the cybersecurity world. And the challenge we face is, how do we recognize that these drivers are going to be pushing us farther and farther and farther down the road from a cybersecurity standpoint? It really enables AI. I mentioned it briefly a moment ago. AI relies on a clean stream of data, large amounts of data. The more data, the better, almost, from an AI standpoint, because it can learn more and recognize patterns. From a cyber attack standpoint, it's just a matter of time before AI is used extensively to find out likely targets out there on the internet and turn around and start to face them. Well, what are we doing here in the cybersecurity world today to answer this? How are we answering the fact that our adversaries are as technologically advanced as anybody, perhaps in some cases even more so? How are we answering that? That's one of the biggest challenges we face. Simply put, because that was a lot of words, the pace of cybersecurity is not a straight line. It is a curve, and it's getting faster and faster and faster.
So I come in at it's a different approach, but it's an approach that I feel very passionate about. It's the people side of things. I talked about earlier the guys that are actually taking care of the systems. There's an education that has to go on there. But there's another education that needs to go on, and I've got examples where too much knowledge is a bad thing. And what I mean by that is IT I've got one particular example where it was a hospital group, and the IT said, look, we're going to start patching everything and bring it up to speed. Well, they pushed out Java updates to 50 hospitals. And as a result, they locked the guys out of their system. Well, all of these had operatory suites. And if you know anything about balancing air inside of an operatory suite, you have to have it precisely balanced so that the germs get out of there. Well, if you can't see it and you can't monitor it, you have to cancel surgeries. So they had to cancel surgeries for 50 locations for 2 days, millions of dollars. Another one where this large retail building downtown New York, they had over 10,000 devices. They ran a QualiScan against it because they were going to be, ready to go day open. They knocked 60% of the devices offline. And when I say they were offline, they were hard offline, meaning you had to go to the devices and pull the plugs. So the reason I bring this up is, yes, we need to educate the people that are working on the systems, but if IT wants to get involved, we need them involved, but we need them to be educated before they get involved, because they need to know that these devices see a lot of their techniques as DDoSs, like an attack, because they're just not built to withstand it.
I really like the response, Fred. Kind of like it really shows some of the challenges that if you want to solve security just from a cybersecurity perspective, but don't understand the other side, then what good do we actually do, right? There, as you pointed out very nicely, there are obviously some downside risk of that. Running into the risk of using, again, resilience as a response to the question, which I apologize for. I might have overused that here, but I think this is really critical, right? I mean, anticipating those things will happen, because we cannot prevent every attack. How do we respond as an organization, as a building, as a smart cities? What are backups? What are redundant systems? What are other ways to deal with things? And I think that's, again, part of a people and process kind of thing that we need to train for, right? Because we know things are coming. Why are we not prepared for that? I think that that's a slightly different notion of resilience, but here I think it's very crucial that we think along those lines to make our response better, in the sense of the goal is to, yes, things are coming, but we will be able to get up quickly up and running in short time.
Great. So we have a lot of questions. Let's move to questions. It was a great discussion, but let's see some of the questions. So Dan asked about safety. And I believe Andy, you already answered about the safety in the vendors, so maybe we'll bring a different question. And then if you didn't answer your questions, please ask again or tell us on the chat. 1 second. Okay, here's an interesting one. So Hug asked about ROI in cybersecurity. And then it's interesting part because to put cybersecurity in the buildings, you probably need to invest quite a lot. Is the ROI there, or is it a separate discussion because we may have a compliance?
So I think further down in the question, somebody answered, or at least partially answered, that cybersecurity in buildings first starts with human safety, and there's no doubt about that. When you think about how critical some of these buildings are, Fred, you mentioned a lot about hospitals. I think about municipal buildings like schools with children in them. These are critical buildings that we have to protect. ROI equations for some of those very critical facilities is pretty easy, because the impact of any sort of cyber attack is going to be pretty serious. But as you slide down the scale into other types of buildings, other parts of a smart city infrastructure, it's not that you want to say, I accept cyber risk. It's that you have to measure risk against the investment. And so to do this, you really have to understand the risk equation. And it really gets down to just what I said a moment ago about the critical infrastructure, really understanding the impacts. If I lost a rail line for a few days due to a ransomware attack, just how impactful would that be? Well, it depends on what the rail line's doing. If it's moving, heating fuel in the middle of the winter, that could be pretty serious. If it's moving people as a commuter line, that could be pretty serious. But if it's doing something else, maybe you could afford a little bit of an outage. So understanding that risk equation, and bringing it into that discussion of ROI will help you get to the point where you can have a data-driven conversation rather than a conversation driven by fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
There's a thing out there, and I don't want to say that I understand it totally, but it's called a ROSI, which is return on security investment. And I looked at it, and it's an attempt to kind of quantify what the risk is and how much it costs and everything. But I also heard somebody else say one time, taking cybersecurity seriously is like buying flood insurance, because flooding, we can all have flood insurance, all of us on this call, and we may or may not ever have a flood. But if you have a flood in a commercial office building, it's going to be rather expensive. Well, the same thing applies here. So you got to understand your risk of the cyber flood, and it may or may not happen. But if it does, just know that when it hits, it's going to hurt.
So both you and Andy mentioned risks. And they have a question from Marina about the risk of dumb buildings and smart buildings.
That's it. So, that's the reason I'm laughing is because this is something that I've heard before. If we stop and think about the history of buildings, there's actually been digital control in there, and Andy can probably knows this better than I do, is there's been digital controls in buildings for 30, 40 years. So finding a truly dumb building, not saying that there's not some out there that are relatively dumb, but there's going to be some form of communication in there. And to give you another example, we had a building out in LA, and it wouldn't have mattered if it was smart or dumb. The parking vendor had a printer in his office, and we went out and do an assessment, and I said, well, we need to go over there and look at the parking vendor. He said, oh, no, they're not connected to our network. They don't even, it's all RS-232 and all that. And I said, well, your name's on the building. Well, 2 weeks later, when I went out, the guy met me, and he said, well, you remember when you told me we should look at that? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, we had somebody get remotely into the wireless printer and print, there's a bomb in the building. Well, they had to dump the building to find out if there was any bombs in there. It doesn't matter if that building was smart or not. I can guarantee you there's a computer somewhere. And if somebody can get in and do something like that. So
there's basically networks everywhere. And we
some form or fashion.
Yeah, we pay past dumb buildings.
I think if I just quickly add to this question, right? The goal is here, how can we drive value from those smart buildings, right? And I think that comes into the equation. I think obviously the value that we drive makes a difference in that equation, right? And I think, yes, we add certain risk by making things smart everywhere. I mean, I think we do it on a daily basis as individuals when we use certain smart technologies. But I think we do that because we are more efficient and more effective. And there is a trade-off that each of us, and there's often like private individual choices about how we make those decisions. And the hope is, I guess, and the goal over time to make smart buildings not only smarter and more effective, but also secure while making them smarter.
Thank you. Fred, you mentioned quite a lot about asset management, and I'm agreeing with you 100%. We have a question here from Gordy about how do we actually do this?
So that's a good question. And this is a question we've been working on for the past 4 or 5 years. There is manufacturers out there that have developed asset management tracking for the ICS space, and they are moving over into the building space. The problem is the libraries are not complete yet, and so there's that's one thing. The other thing is when I mentioned that the integrator comes in and sets up the building, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll drop unmanaged switches in there. They'll do a Class C network, and there's really nothing for a tool to come in and attach to, because you can't mirror report. You can't do any of that. So it's an evolution. It's coming. But at the very least, if you just periodically ran an Nmap on your network or something, set up a process. You may not be able to do it automatically, but you can set up processes.
You mentioned libraries. I'm
Yes.
You're talking about fingerprinting. Maybe you can
explain
a bit more about if people don't understand what it's mean.
Yeah, so there's characteristics for each one of the devices that And you know, to kind of go back to IT for just a minute, it's like I tell people, when you look at IT systems, there are, I don't know how many flavors of different things. There may be 10 or 20. In my world, there's hundreds and hundreds of different devices, protocols. You got Modbus, you got BACnet, you got LAN, you got all of these different protocols. Some of them are serial, some of them are IP based. So what these libraries do is they attempt to identify them, but there's, even once it's identified, there's a verify. So when you first set up and get a snapshot of your network, and it tells you, even these systems that will tell you, well, I think this is an, you know, ABC from Acme or whatever it is. You need to go out and verify that's what it is. You also, there's information that you got to collect that's not a part of that. Where, you know, location in the building, is it in a locked cabinet? You know, all of this other stuff. But back to the library thing. Libraries are developing, but they still got a little ways to go.
Every device has its unique characteristics. How you interact with it, the protocols, the language, so to speak, that it talks, is unique. And as you mentioned, if they have an authentication step to go through, you got to understand how to authenticate yourself to that device. And these libraries, these ways to interface with the building automation systems, you know, these are being tackled now. And they're learning, just like industrial control cybersecurity learned from system and functional safety. Building automation can learn from industrial automation.
Yeah, and there's multiple ways to passively collect information, to scan the network with scanning tools and many others, put devices on the span port. There's quite a lot of options to do it in our work to collect information. But as I mentioned, how do you actually classify it? How do you know what it is?
There's a little precaution there. Is one of the things that you'll see when you talk to these building guys is they don't like change. So when you come in and you start touching their network, they're going to get a little bit protective about that. And especially if you start ripping out switches and putting in different switches and re-IPing things. So again, I have to go back to the culture. We got to educate the culture that this is a necessary thing.
Great. Probably our last question for today from Untouchable. How the government can help with legislations to help basically have smart buildings?
Wow. That's a can of worms. So government certainly can help. I want to be careful. You should be careful before asking for legislation because, you know, as I have heard many times from customers, compliance to legislation does not necessarily translate into cybersecurity. Legislation, again, is written as best intention, point in time thinking, but cybersecurity is constantly evolving. Attack vectors are constantly evolving, and there's no guarantee that legislation is going to keep up with it. But it can be helpful to begin the conversation. I've seen more cyber activity around the threat of not being able to sell products into a region in the world because we're not compliant with some piece of legislation than almost any other motivator out there. I would even go so far as to say of the list of motivators for cybersecurity to drive people towards securing, regulation, legislation is probably up there right at the top, certainly in the top one or two.
Real quick, I mean, I'm not going to take up much time. If the people listening want to learn a little bit more, there is an organization. It's a nonprofit organization. I'm actually a part of it. It's called buildingcybersecurity.org. Schneider has become involved with several of the manufacturers, but also some of the insurance carriers who are trying to help motivate and push. But this was born out of the government saying, hey, look, we know we can't solve everything. So some of the people that head this up are some people, names that you would know. The guy right now who's the CEO is Lucian Niemeyer. He came out of the National Security Council, assistant secretary, but now he is officially CEO. So check that out. There's some information there to help.
I've worked with Lucian before. I can back up what you said.
He's a power to be reckoned with, isn't he?
Yes.
He's a good man.
Andrew, Fred, Andreas, thank you very much. Very, very good discussions. There are some questions that we didn't have time to answer. So sorry about this, people. If you want to send us to info@cybits, we'll definitely make sure we get back to you. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today for the State of Cybersecurity Industry panel. And again, thank you to the panelists. This show will be on YouTube, and you're more than welcome to watch all the previous shows as well about different topics. And don't forget to join us in the future. And my name is Evgeniy, and have an awesome day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.